Okay, so picture this, right? Like a mother bear, uh, teeth bared and standing all protective over her cub.
Yeah.
It's powerful imagery, right?
Absolutely.
And it like perfectly captures this whole idea that we have about maternal instinct, like this fierce primal drive to protect our young. But
Yeah.
what if I told you that the way that we think about maternal instinct today is actually like a surprisingly new concept?
Hmm. That's interesting.
Yeah, and that's been shaped by all these like social forces and even some pretty questionable science.
It is fascinating, isn't it, how certain ideas, even ones that seem so fundamental to like human nature, can be surprisingly modern inventions.
That's exactly right.
Yeah.
And so today we are going to unpack some of these like deeply ingrained myths about motherhood. We're
Yeah.
going to be diving into an episode of NPR's Throughline podcast that really gets into the historical context of these myths.
Okay.
And you'll be amazed at how much they still affect our lives today, even if we don't even realize it.
I mean, these myths aren't just harmless stories,
Yeah.
right? They have real consequences,
Hmm.
impacting everything from social policy to how we value or devalue certain types of work.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
So let's just start with myth number one, the maternal instinct.
Okay.
We all know that image, right? That mama bear protecting her cub.
Yeah.
It feels so natural, so ingrained.
Right.
But the Throughline episode introduces Chelsea Conaboy, the author of Mother Brain.
Okay.
And she kind of challenges this whole notion.
Hmm.
Conaboy argues that what we call maternal instinct isn't some pre-programmed biological imperative. It's actually a much more complex process,
Yeah.
influenced by hormones, sure, but also shaped by a woman's individual experiences.
Conaboy really emphasizes the incredible plasticity of the brain,
Right.
how it's constantly adapting and changing based on our experiences.
Right.
And this means that fathers and other non-birthing parents can develop similar bonding instincts through caregiving.
So it's not just about biology.
Right.
It's about the act of caring for another human being.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And this understanding really challenges the very foundation of this maternal instinct myth.
Yeah.
It suggests that anyone, regardless of gender or biology, can develop those deep nurturing instincts through experience.
And here's where things get really interesting.
Okay.
Conaboy actually traces the roots of this whole maternal instinct myth back to the early 20th century, specifically to a psychologist named William McDougall.
Okay.
Now, McDougall was a prominent figure, but his views on maternal instinct were, let's just say, problematic.
Okay.
He believed that this instinct was so powerful that it even trumped a woman's desire for education or a career.
And unfortunately, McDougall's ideas were entangled with some deeply flawed and even harmful views about race and eugenics.
McDougall's work was very much a product of its time, reflecting the prevailing social and scientific biases of the early 20th century.
It's a great example of how seemingly scientific ideas can be used to reinforce existing power structures and social hierarchies.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Fortunately, though, McDougall's ideas weren't universally accepted.
Right.
In fact, he was challenged by another psychologist, Lita Hollingworth, as early as 1916.
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
Oh, okay.
Hollingworth was a remarkable woman. She directly confronted McDougall's theories, calling maternal instinct a cheap device used to pressure women into having children.
Wow.
She argued that there was no real scientific basis for this idea of like an overwhelming innate drive to mother.
Okay.
And Hollingworth didn't just stop there. She pointed out the hypocrisy of this whole notion of maternal instinct. She was basically saying, if motherhood is so instinctual and women are just naturally meant to do it all, then why aren't we getting any support?
Right.
Why are so many mothers dying in childbirth? Why are women's rights so limited?
That's a powerful argument.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's like she was pulling back the curtain and saying, look, this isn't about biology. It's about control.
Exactly. And if we connect this to the larger historical context, we see how these ideas about motherhood were very much tied to the rise of industrialization and the changing nature of work.
Yeah. As more men moved into factories and offices, the home became this idealized space of domesticity and virtue.
Right.
And of course, it was women who were expected to uphold that ideal.
It was during this period that the image of the selfless content housewife really took hold.
Yeah.
But as we'll see, that image, just like the myth of maternal instinct, is far more complicated than it appears.
Absolutely.
Yeah. And that kind of brings us to our second myth,
Okay.
which really exposes how societal expectations can clash with the realities of people's lives.
Yeah.
And this is the myth of the welfare queen,
Right.
an image that has been used to justify discrimination and deny support to those who need it most.
I remember growing up and hearing about welfare queens.
Yeah.
and just thinking that it was about, lazy people taking advantage of the system.
Right.
But the Through Line episode really opened my eyes to the human stories behind this harmful stereotype. They featured a woman named Johnny Tillman, a welfare mother and activist who became a powerful voice in the National Welfare Rights Organization
Okay.
back in the 1960s and 70s.
Tillman's story is such a perfect example of how these myths are used to dehumanize entire groups of people.
Yeah.
She spoke really powerfully about the way that society devalues certain individuals,
Right.
saying, if you're any one of those things, you count less as a human being. If you're all of those things, you don't count at all except as a statistic.
Wow, that's a powerful quote.
Yeah.
It makes you realize that these myths aren't just abstract ideas. They have real consequences for real people.
Absolutely. So to understand how this myth took root, we need to go back to the origins of federal welfare programs in the U.S.
Okay.
The Social Security Act of 1935
Right.
was a landmark piece of legislation, but it was also deeply flawed,
Yeah.
particularly in how it treated women.
You mean how it reinforced those traditional gender roles we were just talking about?
Exactly. The program was based on this assumption that women needed a man to support them, and that their place was in the home, not in the workforce.
Right.
This, of course, ignored the realities of many women's lives, especially women of color,
Yeah.
who were often excluded from these programs altogether.
It's almost like the system was designed to keep certain groups of women dependent and marginalized.
And as more women of color started receiving welfare benefits in the 1950s and 60s,
Yeah.
the program became increasingly racialized.
Okay.
And that's when this image of the welfare queen really started to take hold.
It's so frustrating how these stereotypes can be used to justify cutting social programs and denying support to those who need it most.
This image of the welfare queen was just a convenient scapegoat,
Right.
a way to blame individuals for these systemic problems
Right.
and avoid addressing the root causes of poverty and inequality.
What about women like Johnny Tillman?
Right.
They weren't lazy or trying to exploit the system.
Right.
They're just trying to survive and provide for their families.
Exactly. And Tillman was a fierce advocate for these women.
Right.
She helped organize mothers who are on welfare, fighting for better treatment, job training, affordable childcare, and basic dignity.
It's amazing how these personal stories can challenge these deeply ingrained narratives.
Absolutely. And Tillman and the National Welfare Rights Organization were fighting for something even bigger.
Oh, what?
A guaranteed adequate income for all Americans, regardless of their race, gender, or family structure.
Wait, a guaranteed income.
Yeah.
That sounds kind of radical, doesn't it?
It might sound radical today,
Yeah.
but it was an idea that gained traction with some surprising figures back then,
Okay.
including Martin Luther King Jr. and even Richard Nixon.
Wow. I never knew that. It shows that there was a time when these ideas were more mainstream than they are now.
Unfortunately, though, the myth of the welfare queen proved to be incredibly powerful.
Yeah.
It undermined public support for these social safety nets
Right.
and contributed to the dismantling of welfare programs, a process that continues to this day.
So the legacy of this myth is still with us,
Yes,
shaping our attitudes and our policies.
absolutely. And it's not just about welfare. It's about how we value caregiving work in general.
Yeah.
The myth of the welfare queen feeds into this larger narrative that devalues the work that women do both in the home and in the paid workforce.
It's like society wants to pretend that this essential work raising children, caring for the elderly, keeping households running, just magically happens without any effort or sacrifice.
And that brings us to our third myth,
Okay.
which dives even deeper into these societal expectations surrounding women and caregiving.
So we talked about the myth of the maternal instinct, right?
Yeah.
And how it really downplays the role of experience and even like tries to limit women's choices. Then there's the myth of the welfare queen,
Right.
which demonizes those who need support and like perpetuates these really harmful stereotypes.
Yeah.
But this third myth is almost insidious in how it dresses up exploitation as something like noble and good.
You're talking about the myth of the doting housewife.
Yes.
This image of the stay-at-home mom who just finds complete fulfillment in her domestic duties. Right. Happily sacrificing her own needs for the good of her family.
It's like this romanticized ideal that ignores the very real labor and often the lack of choice involved in that kind of life.
Yeah.
So the Through Line episode brings in Silvia Federici,
Okay.
an Italian feminist scholar who really challenges this whole notion.
Federici's perspective is so valuable because she connects her personal experiences to this broader societal myth.
Okay.
She talks about growing up and witnessing her own mother's domestic labor being completely dismissed and devalued.
It's almost like society wants to pretend that all this essential work, like raising children, cooking, cleaning, caring for the elderly, all this just magically happens without any effort or sacrifice.
And that's exactly the point that Federici and other feminists were trying to make.
Yeah.
They argued that this work, often called women's labor of social reproduction, is absolutely essential for society to function.
Okay, so break that down for me. What exactly is social reproduction?
Okay, so think about it this way. Without people to raise children, care for the sick, and maintain households, the workforce wouldn't exist. This labor creates and sustains the very people who go out and do all the other jobs that we traditionally think of as work.
Wow, I never thought about it like that before.
Yeah,
Be like this whole hidden economy that we just take for granted.
exactly. And because it's often unpaid and done within the home, it's easy to overlook its value. But without it, society would literally grind to a halt.
So Federici is saying that this work deserves to be recognized and valued,
Right.
not just dismissed as like women's work.
Right. And she wasn't just critiquing the system, she was actively working to change it.
Okay.
Federici was actually a key figure in the wages for housework movement,
Okay.
which demanded that this labor be economically recognized and compensated.
Now, that's an interesting idea. Paying women for the work that they do in the home. I'm curious, did this movement face any pushback?
Oh, absolutely.
Huh?
The wages for housework movement was controversial even within feminist circles. Some critics argued that it reinforced the idea that women's place was in the home.
So how did the movement respond to that?
They were very intentional about their language. They avoided using terms like love and care because they didn't want to romanticize this work.
Right.
They wanted to reframe it as essential labor worthy of economic value, not just sentimental value.
It's like they were saying, look, this work is hard, it's necessary, and it deserves to be compensated just like any other job.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And it's interesting to consider how that movement might resonate today.
Yeah.
We're seeing more and more conversations about the value of care work, especially as the population ages and the need for elder care increases.
Yeah, that's true. It
Yeah.
feels like we're at a turning point where we have to start rethinking these traditional roles and expectations.
Absolutely.
Huh.
And recognizing the value of care work, whether it's paid or unpaid, is essential for building a more just and equitable society.
So what does this all mean for our listeners?
Yeah.
We've unpacked these three powerful myths about motherhood. But how can we apply these insights to our own lives?
Well, I think the key takeaway is to be aware of these myths and how they might be influencing our own thinking and actions.
Okay.
We need to be critical of the messages that we receive about motherhood and caregiving and start asking questions like, who benefits from these narratives? And what are the real costs of perpetuating these myths?
It's like we've been handed these stories about motherhood.
Yeah.
And we haven't always stopped to examine whether they're true or whether they serve us.
Exactly. And it's important to remember that these myths aren't just these abstract ideas. They have real-world consequences.
Right.
They shape our policies, our workplaces, our relationships, even our own sense of self-worth.
So it's not enough to just understand these myths intellectually. We have to actively challenge them in our own lives and in our communities.
Absolutely. Talk to your friends, family, and elected officials. Share your experiences. Challenge stereotypes. Advocate for policies that support caregivers.
Yeah.
Don't underestimate the power of your voice and your actions to create change.
Well, that's our deep dive into the myths of motherhood.
Yeah, it's been an interesting one.
It's been eye-opening, to say the least. I hope this conversation has challenged you to think differently about the way we value caregiving in our society and the importance of supporting those who do this essential work,
Yeah.
whether they're mothers, fathers, or anyone else.
It's such important work.
It is. And as always, we encourage you to keep exploring these issues. Read more, have conversations, get involved, because together we can create a world where caregiving is truly valued, supported, and shared more equitably.
Absolutely.